Imagine walking into a grocery store anywhere on Earth and picking up a simple carton of 12 eggs. Same product, same basic nutrition, completely different price. That price quietly tells a story about income, farming, transport, politics, feed costs, currency strength, and even culture. In the United States, a dozen large eggs usually sits somewhere between $2 and $4 in normal times. During shortages or bird flu outbreaks, it can jump higher, sometimes $5 or $6 in certain states. Industrial-scale poultry farming, government subsidies on corn and soy feed, and massive distribution networks keep prices relatively stable most of the year. Still, even inside the US, the price changes by state. California often costs more because of animal welfare laws. Midwest states tend to be cheaper because the farms are closer. Move north to Canada, and the price goes up. A dozen eggs there often lands around $3 to $5 when converted from Canadian currency. Supply management policies protect local farmers, but that protection also keeps prices higher. Eggs are rarely cheap in Canada, even when global feed prices drop. Cross the Atlantic to the United Kingdom and you'll usually see prices in the range of $3 to $4 per dozen. Free-range eggs dominate the shelves, and cage-free regulations push costs higher. Supermarkets sometimes sell eggs cheaply as a loss leader, but farmers regularly complain they're being squeezed. When energy prices rise, egg prices follow. Western Europe tells a similar story with small differences. In Germany, France, and the Netherlands, a dozen eggs often costs between $3 and $5. Organic and free-range options can go much higher. Europe's strict animal welfare rules, higher labor costs, and environmental regulations all show up in the final price. Southern Europe is slightly cheaper. In Spain, Portugal, and parts of Italy, you might find a dozen eggs for $2.50 to $4. Backyard farming still exists in rural areas, but city prices reflect supermarket logistics and imported feed. Now look east. In Poland, Romania, and Bulgaria, eggs are noticeably cheaper. One dozen can cost as little as $1.50 to $3. Lower labor costs and local grain production help keep prices down, though inflation has been pushing them upward in recent years. Russia, when prices are converted to US dollars, often sits around $2 to $3 per dozen. Sanctions, currency fluctuations, and domestic production all play a role. When the ruble weakens, dollar prices appear low, even if locals feel the strain. In Turkey, a dozen eggs usually costs around $1.50 to $3. Eggs are a staple protein, and local production is strong. However, high inflation means prices change fast. What looks cheap in dollars may feel expensive to Turkish families. The Middle East shows sharp contrasts. In Saudi Arabia, a dozen eggs often costs around $2 to $3. Government support for agriculture and controlled pricing help stabilize costs. Imported feed still matters, but large-scale farms keep shelves full. In the UAE, prices are slightly higher, often around $3 to $4 per dozen. Almost everything depends on imports, from feed to packaging. Premium brands and organic labels push prices even higher in upscale supermarkets. Iran is an interesting case. In dollar terms, a dozen eggs can appear extremely cheap, sometimes under $1, but this is mostly currency collapse. For local residents, eggs are not cheap at all relative to income. Dollar conversion hides the real pain. Now move south into South Asia. In India, a dozen eggs usually costs between $1 and $2, sometimes even less in rural areas. Eggs are one of the most affordable protein sources in the country. Local production, low labor costs, and short supply chains keep prices down. Still, prices spike during festivals, heat waves, or feed shortages. Pakistan is similar. A dozen eggs often falls between $1 and $2 when converted to USD. Inflation can push it higher temporarily, but eggs remain a key low-cost food. Again, dollar pricing doesn't reflect local purchasing power. Sri Lanka and Bangladesh also sit in that low range, roughly $1 to $2 per dozen, though shortages can cause sudden jumps. China produces more eggs than almost any country on Earth. A dozen eggs there usually costs around $1.50 to $3. Massive industrial farms, efficient logistics, and government oversight keep prices relatively controlled. Regional differences exist, but eggs are still considered affordable. Japan tells a different story. A dozen eggs often costs around $3 to $5. Quality standards are extremely high, packaging is meticulous, and consumers expect uniform size and freshness. Even so, eggs are seen as good value because quality is consistent. South Korea sits in a similar range, roughly $3 to $5 per dozen, sometimes more during disease outbreaks. The government often intervenes to stabilize supply. Southeast Asia varies widely. In Thailand, a dozen eggs can cost around $1.50 to $2.50. In Vietnam, it may be closer to $1 to $2. Local farms and warm climates help, but disease outbreaks can disrupt supply quickly. Indonesia and the Philippines often see prices around $2 to $3 per dozen. Eggs are a major protein source, so governments keep a close eye on pricing. Now look at Africa. In Egypt, a dozen eggs often costs around $1 to $2 in USD terms. Again, currency value plays a big role. For locals, eggs can still feel expensive during inflation spikes. In Nigeria, prices fluctuate heavily. A dozen eggs might cost around $2 to $3, sometimes more. Feed costs, fuel prices, and transport challenges push prices up. Power outages and heat also affect storage. South Africa tends to be higher. A dozen eggs often costs around $2.50 to $4. Commercial farming dominates and energy costs have a strong impact. Kenya and East African countries often fall around $2 to $3 per dozen depending on region and season. Eggs are widely consumed, but supply chains are fragile. Now South America. In Brazil, a dozen eggs usually costs around $1.50 to $3. Brazil produces massive amounts of corn and soy, which keeps feed costs low. Eggs are cheap by global standards. Argentina is unpredictable. In dollar terms, eggs can look extremely cheap, sometimes under $1 per dozen. But this is currency distortion. Locals experience constant price changes and shortages. Chile and Uruguay are more stable. A dozen eggs there often costs around $3 to $4. In Mexico, a dozen eggs usually costs around $2 to $3. Eggs are a dietary staple, and the country is one of the world's largest consumers per capita. Price sensitivity is high, so production is tightly managed. Australia and New Zealand are among the most expensive. In Australia, a dozen eggs often costs $4 to $6, sometimes more for free range. Strict welfare laws, high labor costs, and long transport distances all add up. New Zealand is similar, often $4 to $5 per dozen. So what does all this mean? The price of a dozen eggs is not really about eggs. It's about feed prices, especially corn and soy. It's about fuel and electricity. It's about how far the eggs travel. It's about laws, subsidies, and trade rules. It's about currency strength and inflation. And it's about how much people earn. In rich countries, eggs cost more in dollars but take up a smaller share of income. In poorer countries, eggs look cheap in dollars but can be expensive relative to wages. A $2 carton in one country can feel like pocket change. In another, it's a serious purchase. Eggs also act like an early warning signal. When feed prices rise, egg prices move fast. When disease hits poultry farms, eggs disappear from shelves before many other foods. When inflation accelerates, eggs are one of the first items people notice. That's why politicians talk about egg prices. That's why headlines scream when a carton jumps by $1. A dozen eggs is small, ordinary, and universal. And because of that, it quietly reflects the economic reality of almost every country on Earth. Next time you see eggs in a store, think about where they came from, what went into producing them, and why that number on the price tag looks the way it does. 1 dozen eggs can tell you more about the world than most headlines ever will. And behind all these price differences, there's one uncomfortable question that keeps coming back. Is this just economics? Or is this what a banana republic really looks like? Same eggs, same nutrition. But in some countries, a few dollars is nothing. In others, that same carton feels like a luxury. Weak currencies, broken systems, bad decisions, corruption, mismanagement, dependence on imports, endless inflation. When money loses meaning, even eggs turn into a problem. In places where systems work, prices move slowly. In places where systems fail, prices jump overnight. Today it's eggs. Tomorrow it's flour, fuel, electricity. That's how everyday life exposes the truth no speech ever will. So ask yourself, when a country can't keep the price of a basic food staple, what does that say about the rest of the economy? Is this just global market pressure? Or is this the signature of a banana republic? Drop your thoughts in the comments. If this made you think, you already know what to do.